And on today's news, hydrometers. G'day and welcome to my channel, the Homebrew Network. Hydrometers. This video I've actually recorded many times over the years. None have ever been uploaded. And one of the reasons is I keep getting new ones and I go, oh, I'll re-record it and add that one in. And I'll re-record it and add that one in. So they've never been uploaded. And even up to today, I do have a new one coming that's a little bit secret in the mail. So I thought I've got to do this, get it out of the way, then we'll focus, on the next one that comes along. Now I could easily do a video on each of these different hydrometers, refractors, density meters, whatever you want to call them. But let's go back to the start and the basics, and we'll look at a hydrometer, which is the first tool that most people will use in brewing to measure their wort. And what it does is it measures the amount of sugar in the wort. So that's a hydrometer. Most people have broke one or two in their brewing career. This one I've had a long time, and I shouldn't say that, but I have. It's way over 15 years old, and you can tell my tube's all yellowed and sticky taped together. To use one of these, you'll need some sort of testing tube usually. A glass one or a plastic one, it doesn't matter. Now the way these work is you fill them up or nearly fill them up with your wort, which is your sugary water before the yeast has converted it into beer. And you float your hydrometer in it. The more sugars that are in the wort, the higher the hydrometer floats. You take your reading, and then at the end of ferment or even during the ferment, as the sugars are eaten by the yeast and converted to alcohol, your hydrometer slides down and you can take another reading. You use those two numbers, the first reading and the last reading, to work out how much alcohol is in your beer. And that's the same for wine. You do use slightly different hydrometers for spirits and things, but they all work basically the same. You'll find online people saying all different ways to read these properly. And you need to be aware of the meniscus, which is just the water as it sits up against the hydrometer, and surface tension and things. It sort of rides up the side of the hydrometer. There's another way I used to see in the old books, and it was to, you lower your head down until you just see a flat line across, and that's where your reading is. So if everything was textbook A-OK, you'd be taking the reading at the bottom of the meniscus at water level. Most will be really close, but there could be some that are out. Maybe the paper scale is shifted for whatever reason. So the best way to make sure your hydrometer is reading as correctly as can be is to float your hydrometer in some water. You could use distilled water. I found tap water just good enough. And you make sure it's reading that 1.000. Say, for instance, it's reading 1.002. Then you have to remember when you take a reading with your wort to take that 002 off your reading that you're getting. That's the only way you'll get even nearly accurate with a hydrometer. And it might be reading 1.000 at the top of the meniscus, and that's fine. But you've got to remember when you take your reading with your wort to take your reading from that top of the meniscus. They're a simple instrument to learn and to use, just don't drop it. And then, about 10 years ago, probably a little bit more, Cooper's brought out these plastic hydrometers. They work exactly the same, but there was a problem. And I don't think it ever got fixed because Cooper's were nice enough to send me another 2 extra after I had problems. And what used to happen, I'd be sanitizing things in the buckets of sanitizer, of course, or trays of sanitizer. And one of these joints here would let water into it, so it wouldn't read right. So you'd make your beer, and if you'd accidentally left it in sanitizer for a couple of hours or overnight, the next time you'd come to make a reading, you go, hey, hang on, that's not right. So they leak. So it's just something to remember. And also, as you can see me straightening that, I haven't used these for a while. They might have been in a box, but they bend and stuff. The idea's there, and they're okay for your first or second brew, but after that, go and buy a decent one. Or just don't soak them in sanitizer, and you might have better luck than I did. I forgot to mention that when you take your zeroing reading, your water should be around 20 degrees. 20 degrees would be perfect, but realise it's not always like that. So, 18, 22, somewhere around that. and that'll give you a more accurate reading. Now that's the same with your wort as well, or you can't have hot wort. It'll give you a wrong reading. The density of the liquids and things change, and it'll give you a wrong reading. Also, with these glass ones, sometimes this paper sleeve in there with the readings on it, they've got a little bit of dab of hot glue inside to keep it in place. And some of them, if you put that in hot wort, 100 degrees or something, that hot glue will melt and that paper can shift, and then your readings are out. Again, you can zero it with water and find out how much it's out. But if it starts moving around and it's not stuck there in the right place, you're better off getting a new one. I've had people argue with me before to say that they've used theirs in hot wort for 10 years and it's never mattered, but they're not all the same. And you'll find, even this one says, do not boil, do not use it in hot liquids. You can take that chance if you like. So hydrometers are used by beginners, but they're also used by pros, even in a professional brewery. The trouble with hydrometers, especially when you move to all grain, is that sometimes you want to take a reading halfway through your mash or the boil, or before the boil and after the boil, and you don't want to have to cool down 100 mils of wort. You can't sort of leave it sitting on the bench for half an hour to cool down. One, you'll get evaporation and that'll skew your reading. And two, you just don't have the time. You want an accurate reading, nice and fast. And that's when most people move on to a refractometer. Now again, they're just for measuring the sugar density in the water or the wort, but they work slightly different. They're called a refractometer because it works from light refracting through the liquid, and you read it on a scale. The way they work is you put a drop of your wort on there, then you look through the hole, and there's a reading up there to take your reading. But again, if you read your instructions on refractometers, it's much better to have your sample at around 20 degrees. Most refractometers will have ATC written on them somewhere. This one doesn't happen to, but that means they're automatic temperature conversion. But don't be fooled by that. That doesn't mean you can still put 100 degree wort on that window and get an accurate reading. Most will have a temperature gap. Some are 0 to 30 degrees, but most these days are 10 degrees to 30 degrees. You want it in that temperature window to get a nice accurate reading. Again, I've seen people dip that in the wort. Usually some professional brewers, that's because they've got more money than I have, but I've seen a lot of people ruin their refractometers doing it like that. And the other thing is things get hot sometimes, and that makes a difference in your temperature readings. Even dropping hot wort on there, you've got it straight out of the boil and you can get a bit of evaporation. That will skew your readings a lot in just one drop of wort. The same again with these. If you want to zero them out, they do have adjustment there. You use a little screwdriver. You use distilled water, a couple of drops of distilled water. You look through and you zero it out. When I say zero it out, they all go to 1.000. And when I mention zero out, even though the hydrometer, and if you're using this to read specific gravity, which is what a hydrometer reads, it's not 0, it's actually 1, but it's 1.000. There's other ways to read wort. I'm trying to keep this video sort of a little bit basic, but there's other forms, bricks and a few different others, and they do actually start at 0, but their 0 is the same as 1.0 specific gravity. You can get these relatively cheap these days. I bought some really cheap ones and the window fell off. It actually fell off into the wort of my beer as I was boiling. I wasn't very happy about it that day and had to fish it out. So I wouldn't advise to get the cheapest one you can get, but these days you should be able to get one for around $30. There is a slight problem with these. This sounds awesome. You can get a reading with just a couple of drops of wort instead of 100 ml of wort. But the trouble with these, once you get alcohol into the mix of the wort, like once the yeast has started working, it will skew your readings. The alcohol skews the refraction. And unless you go through a table, you need to know what your wort was at before it started fermenting, and then you take another reading, and then you have to put it in a table or a calculator to get an accurate reading once there's alcohol in it. So it is possible, it's just a little bit of a pain. Another type of refractometer you might have seen me using the last year or two are these digital refractometers. They work the same way. You have your sample of wort in there, you close the lid and it shines light through it. and it gives you a digital reading just about instantly. I really like these, they're great, but the price jumps up remarkably. Like you've gone from $5 or $6 for your hydro to $25 to $30 for your refractometer, and you're looking at $300 or $400 for one of these. If you are going to buy one of these, there's many different ones. One's for honey, one's for wine, one's specifically for beer. This one's sort of in the middle. It's not specifically for beer, but it does give bricks and specific gravity, not as 1.045 say, but it reads 4.5. So it does give you an idea, but it also gives you the bricks reading, which a lot of pro brewers will be using anyway. Again, you calibrate it or zero this with water, and again, it needs to be around that 20-degree mark. The way I do it, I use a pipette, the same I would for the normal refractometer. I just have a glass of cold water or ice water on the desk, and I just swish around the pipette in the ice water, and that gets it down to the right temperature within seconds. And that stops any evaporation immediately, so you get a nice accurate reading. All of these refractometers, they do shine light through the liquid, as I said, and some you'd really want a nice clean sample. You don't want bits of grain in there, and sometimes they do struggle, with a really oaty or thick sort of wort. The clearer the sample, the more accurate and the better they work. Now we're going to move into a little bit of a different area here. These are things that measure your wort in the fermenter as it's fermenting, so you don't have to take a sample. You've seen me use these many times in my brewing videos. One you haven't seen me use yet though is the Plaato. Craig gave me this to try from One Man Brewing, and unfortunately I haven't tried it yet because I've been pressure fermenting and I haven't used a airlock like this, but I'm going to in the very near future. So I'm not 100% on the accuracy or how these ones work. I assume it's from the CO2 because it's the only thing it could be. The CO2 or the pressure from the CO2 going through the fluid and going through the device, and it's somehow measuring your wort density or your specific gravity via that method. But that's a future video. Thanks to Craig for that. Now we move on to the floating hydrometers. These work a little bit differently. The first one I ever saw, it's a long time ago now, it might be 12 years ago or something. They used to make them out of Wii controllers. So the Nintendo Wii's, the handle controllers used to move around to play your video games. They took them apart, modified them, and put them in a tube like that, and used it to take readings of the wort. And the way all of these floating hydrometers work is it works on the angle they float at. The density of the liquid, the sugars in the liquid, whether fermentable or non-fermentable, will make it float a certain way. The device measures the angle, and you use little programs that you don't have to worry about because other people have done them, and that to give you your readings from whatever angle it's floating at. But the first ones that were around, homemade, that weren't from a Wii controller but designed about the same, were iSpindels, which was this one here. Now, I've got to thank Brendan Go, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, for this, because he sent me this to try. Now, I haven't done a video on this because I had nothing but trouble. And I know I'm going to cop flack for this, but because other people get them to work perfectly, and I've used them for a long time. But I had real trouble with this. And what happens with these iSpindels, so I'll put a battery in just to demonstrate. And you push them into the tube, and the way that these, see that's too tight already. The way these are supposed to lock in and not sort of move around is by the friction on the side of the circuit boards, on the inner side of the tube. So you're supposed to file down the sides to get it to fit nice, or you can file them right down and sort of put sticky tape on the side to build up the sides. And so it's a bit smoother, because you can see, I don't know if you can pick it up there, it's all scratched. So I thought I'd done mine okay. And I'd hook it up to the computer and the Wi-Fi, and every time I threw it into the fermenter, I wouldn't get a reading. It had just sort of stopped working. So that meant I had to take it in and out a lot of times. Now, the only way to pull these in and out is by the circuit board. And in the end, mine just broke. A couple of bits broke off the circuit board and it was no good anymore. I have bought some replacement parts to swap these boards over, but I just haven't got around to doing it. So even though I broke it with my fingers, it wasn't working already anyway. And what we think, there was a bad batch of these boards at one stage and there was just something wrong with it. One of the parts was loose and wasn't soldered on there properly. They're very small solders and a bit hard to pick up with the naked eye unless you've got a good magnifying glass. And we think that's what the original problem was. So if you are using iSpindels, you know, they do work. They are fiddly at first and the calibration's a little bit of a pain in the butt, but they, you know, they work. But for me, this one just hasn't been fun. It's been too much trouble, too much fiddling around. A lot of people like that tinkering of the time. I don't have the time for it. So I haven't really used the iSpindel at all. Although I've tried a lot of times to get this working. But a big thank you to Brendan. And if you do want an iSpindel, I'll leave a link down below to Brendan. And he makes them here and distributes them in Australia. So after the iSpindel didn't work, I forked out just over $200, I think it was, for a tilt, Australian dollars. Now these work the same way, of course, they float. They work slightly different to these. These work on Wi-Fi. I've already done a video about having to use a Bluetooth repeater to get it to connect to your Wi-Fi. I'll leave a link down below for that as well. But these basically work on Wi-Fi, where these work on Bluetooth. Now there's an advantage to that. The advantage to the Bluetooth is it uses much, much less power. But it's not as a stronger signal. You sort of have to be closer and, you know, things get in the way easier of the Bluetooth signal than they do of the Wi-Fi. So these work by Bluetooth and you usually build something out of a Raspberry Pi or an old phone to have like a repeater. So this speaks to that and then that speaks to your house Wi-Fi and then you can get readings from anywhere. You don't have to have a repeater. You could have this out in your garage, in your fermenter, and just take a reading, walk out there with your phone, hook up to it via Bluetooth on your phone, take a reading and do it that way. That's if you don't want a reading, you know, every 5 minutes, which you don't really need, but some people like it. I like it to have the graph and see how it's going. Now the software that works directly with this without having anything else, like when it talks to your phone, when you have to be near it, works pretty slick. It's easy. It's got calibration in the software. So if it happens to be out a little bit, but you know that your wort is at, you know, 1050, but it's saying 1049, this can be adjusted in the software on your phone directly, and you can monitor it. Once you have that repeater I was talking about, it can talk via Bluetooth to a repeater, then it talks to your Wi-Fi, and then you can read it from all around the world, wherever you want to, check it, change it. It's a good little tool. I stayed away from for a long time because I thought it was overkill. But once you start watching the graphs, and it's really handy to know for dry hopping purposes and things like that when you're getting near the end of your ferment. That's what I like to use them for, especially in fermenters that you can't see through. I've been using the same tilt now several years, maybe 3-4 years. I have had to change the battery once. Things like the iSpindel, because they work on Wi-Fi, choose a lot more power and they probably won't last. You won't get 2 or 3 years out of a battery, but that's okay. You just pull it out and you can charge it. So I've been using the tilt for a little while. Then I got an email from Julian in France and he makes floaties. They're like the iSpindel, but for me, and I can explain why, they're a much better design. And I'll show you this up close, but while you still have to take this in and out like you do the iSpindel, it's 3D printed. So as you can see, if you have to get this in and out to charge it, to calibrate it, whatever you need to do, you're not pulling on the circuit board or parts, you're pulling on the 3D printed part. The 3D printed part also, you know, is designed, it's a little bit springy, so you don't need to have those sides of the circuit board jamming up against the side of the inner tube for it to stay put. I've been working on this one, that's why there's wires sticking out of it. Again, works on Wi-Fi, the same as the iSpindel. You don't really need a repeater, unless it's a long way from your modem. You know, if it's a long way from your modem, then you might need a repeater. If your house modem's in the front of your house, and you're using these in a fridge in the back garden, down in the garage, then yeah, you might need some sort of repeater, because the Wi-Fi signal might not be strong enough. Now, I liked this floaty design so much, I started making them. It was one of the reasons I bought a 3D printer. Now, if you do want to make these at home, one of the parts that's hardest to get is this outside tube. These come all the way from Lithuania. That's a long way away. It can take months to get here sometimes, especially at the moment. And they're not the cheapest things in the world. But there's a little hint if you're looking for these. You usually have to get them from Lithuania. Then we move on to the pill from Kegland. This is one of the newer ones. They've designed their own container for it. You can see why they call it the pill. So these work on Wi-Fi too. Apparently there is Bluetooth on the board as well, but it's not active yet, and I'm not quite sure what they're going to do with that. These also interact with your wrapped fridge, but that's a whole another video in itself. And the pills are around $80, and you just screw them in. And just last week, as much as I loved the original Floaty design, Julian from Floaty has a new design. This one you couldn't make at home because it's got the special circuit board. You know, it's the same as the pill. You couldn't get one of those circuit boards at home. You could make the iSpindel. You couldn't make the tilt, of course, but I haven't used this yet. I've only just got it. I've just charged the battery, but I'm looking forward to it. The thing I've found with the Floaty, at least the original one, the app was good, and all I had to do was turn it on, and I threw it in the first time because I couldn't get my tilt to work at the time. I think the battery was flat. And I threw the Floaty in, first time I'd ever used it. I knew the battery was charged, that's all I knew, the original Floaty, and it just worked. Now, that's not going to happen every time with any of these devices, whether it be the pill, the iSpindel, or the tilt. They're like your Bluetooth headphones or your Bluetooth speakers. Some days you can get up and you can turn them on and they'll just work. And other days you'll get up and go, oh, the Bluetooth is not working. And you'll have to reset, you know, the Bluetooth on your phone or your receiver or the device. So I'm excited to see how this new Floaty goes. I can't say much else about it because I haven't tried it. You'll see me standing them up. There's a reason for that. That's usually when they turn off. So if you're testing these for readings or whatever you're trying to test them for, don't stand them up on their end because they'll turn off and then you'll wonder why you're not getting readings. And I think the pill turns off laying that way. Maybe both, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure the pill turns off when you lay it down. These ones are up, when they're up on the end, they turn off. Now, all of these, it doesn't matter which one it is, iSpindel, tilt, float, pill, they're not 100% accurate. Once you put them in a wort that you know the density of, say you know your worts, as I said before, say 1050, and you put one in and you can calibrate it so it reads 1050 perfectly. By the time it gets to the end of the ferment, this is likely to have bits of krausen stuck on it and yeast and hops, especially if you dry hop and you have a big thick band of hops at the top sometimes before your cold crash. It will throw the readings out. So usually at the end, your reading's not 100% accurate, but you'll still get a consistency in the reading, and that's how you'll know your ferment's over. A lot of the times it'll be close, but if you've got it, like if you're doing an IPA or something with a big heavy dry hop, you might be a fair way out, but you'll still see that flat line and you'll know your ferment's finished. So that's about it. This wasn't meant to be an in-depth look at any of these. I just wanted to give an overall view and let people know what I think of them. I'll leave links below to everything I've talked about. If I miss one, let me know and I'll put it in. I guess I should just say which ones I use mostly out of all of these. At the moment, it's this one, the digital one, because I just like it. It's easy. I don't have to have a refractometer looking out for a bit of sunlight to get a nice clean reading. It's this. Now, there's sometimes I will take a reading on that digital one and go, that can't be right, that can't be right. I break out the refrac and have a look. So, it's good to have this as backup as well. And sometimes they are different. Sometimes they read exactly the same. Sometimes they read slightly different. And that could be just from a dirty reading, as I said, a bit of junk that I can't even see in the wort or the cloudiness of the wort playing around. But it's always good to have that around as backup. But then when I take a reading at the end of the ferment, I still usually go back to the hydro. I know there's days where they all read differently. Like the refrac might be 1050, this might be 1051, this might be 1049. It just happens. And then I have people say, oh, you can't beat the hydro, it's accurate. Well, is it accurate? With the hydro scale, 2 points is about 1 millimetre. It's really hard to get an accurate reading. You sort of think you do, you're in the ballpark, but once you start reading it digitally, it's a different story. And the digital ones can round up or round down differently or different levels, you know what I mean? It only has to be a 0.04, and the next one could read it at 0.06 or something, and that'll come out differently if it rounds it up or rounds it down. As far as the floating ones, the Floaty itself, I like. The pill has been working well for me, and so's the tilt. The iSpindel, I haven't had any luck with, but I know a lot of people do. And as I said earlier, it's only going to be a matter of time before you have trouble. It doesn't matter which one it is, the iSpindel, the tilt, the Floaty, or the pill. One of the days you can have troubles connecting to it or registering it. It just happens. It's part of life, and it's part of, you know, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connectivity. So that's about it. I could go on for hours. I'm not going to. You choose what you like. I'll leave links below so you can go and have a look. I'll keep an eye out in the next week or two. There's a new one coming along that I haven't used before. That looks really exciting. So I'm really looking forward to that. That'll, as I said, next couple of weeks that'll be out. And that's about it. Like, subscribe, share if you like the video. Thanks to my patrons I'll try that again. Thanks to my patrons, because without them these videos couldn't happen. I'm dry. I need to go and get a beer. Oh, look what happened. I went and got a beer. Cheers. Beef is 4x gold. Clone recipe. I apologise for that. I did make the video, but it was nearly an hour long, so I put it on the Patreon page, and then I was meant to come back and shorten it for the main channel because people don't like videos that long. Cut it down. I'll try and cut it down to 10, 15 minutes, and I forgot about it. So I'll do that in the next couple of weeks. Keep an eye out for that. Thanks, Beefer. Cheers. Thanks to Brendan. I'll leave a link for the iSpindels. Thanks to Julian from France for the floaties. And thanks to Keg. The pills are Kegland. The tilts are tilts. I think I got that from Amazon. Thanks to Craig for that. And I bought that from Kegland too. Cheers.